Okay, we're up to our last chapter on 1750 through 1900 through around the World War One. We're going to look at Russia and Japan. Russia and Japan stand apart from the rest of the world because if you remember, the theme of this time period are things like industrialization, imperialism, England taking over India, Europe taking over Africa. Um, Parts of China, they take over the Philippines. Now, we did talk about Latin America, how that stood out and actually gained independence during this time. Two other places that don't really fit because they're not colonized before this time period. So they're independent when they come into this time period and actually remain independent. In fact, kind of become imperialistic nations in and of themselves are Russia and Japan. So that's what we're going to be looking at. Why were Russia and Japan different? Um, well, number one, although they're behind the West on industrialization, they are industrializing. Japan, we're going to learn, does it very much through the Meiji Restoration, and Russia does it also with government help and government push. We'll explain why they need the government in a little bit. But economically, they're going to remain autonomous. In other words, they're going to remain free and independent. Okay. Unlike China and the Middle East, they are not fully resistant to copying Western ideas. Both Japan and Russia will take a lot of Western ideas, military ideas, industrial ideas, government ideas, and try to incorporate them. Japan's going to be a little more flexible than Russia, at least on the government end, because Russia's led by a bunch of czars who really want to maintain their position. So Russia reforms itself really in the middle, and we're going to get to why it does that here in a couple of slides, but really in the middle of the 1800s, in the middle of the 19th century. So what was Russia like before that? Well, Russia was really concerned with isolationism. What had happened to them, you got to kind of put it in historical context. There's that word, we're going to use that a lot, historical context. They were really concerned because of what had happened with the Napoleonic invasions of 1812. Now, they had won, but it had been at tremendous price. They had had to burn cities. People had starved. They had had to burn crops. Moscow, they emptied it. It burned down, all in order to defeat Napoleon. So they did not want this to happen again. They wanted to protect themselves, and they wanted to become a strong military. Elites sponsor inclusion of the arts, but with the Decembrist Revolution, the Decembrist Revolution in St. Petersburg in 1825. Remember, St. Petersburg is the capital of Russia. It's moved from Moscow to St. Petersburg because Peter the Great built the city there. That's right. It was actually a group of about 20,000 military lesser officers, lower ranking officers. By that, I mean not colonels, generals, but lieutenants and these kind. They staged a revolt in the capital of St. Petersburg. Doesn't really go anywhere. The Russian army is huge, and the rest of them listen to the Tsar, and they're able to put it down. But after that point, Tsar Nicholas I decides, not again, not again. He's going to be tough, he's going to be brutal, and he's going to be repressive. And he's going to make sure no one steps out of line in the future. Russia is very heavy-handed approach to dissent. It prevents revolts in the early 1800s. Western Europe actually is the time of revolution. Remember, we talked about the French Revolution, 1789. There are a number of riots in the streets because people want changes. That doesn't happen in Russia. Why? Because in Russia, if you riot, if you protest, you're killed. Okay? They're more conservative and they continue to expand. They particularly like to expand towards Poland, towards Eastern Europe. And the last one down there, they're going to expand towards the Ottoman Empire. Now, that's going to have a big impact, and we'll talk about that. So this Ottoman Empire, now they want to expand. Now, if you remember, Peter the Great had built St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea. That was up near Sweden, up near that area. If you remember, the problem with the port of St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea was that during the winter, when things got really, really cold, what did the Baltic Sea do? Yep, it froze over. So he wants a warm weather port. The Russians do. The Russians want a warm weather port where they can export their goods year round, do business year round. They don't have to shut down during the winter. They can do business year round. Plus, they can send their navy out anytime they want to. Now, they claim it's to protect the Christians in the Ottoman Empire. It's not. Now, if you look at the map, you can see Crimea there. This is just to the south of Russia on the Black Sea, rather. Sorry. Crimea is on the Black Sea. Now, if you look at that map, you say, wait a minute, in the Black Sea, good grief, Mr. McKernan. You mean the English primarily and the French to a lesser degree had to sail out around the Atlantic, through the Straits of Gibraltar, across the Mediterranean Sea, and into the Black Sea to fight the Russians? Well, they're going to lose, right? No. In fact, the British, with help from the French and a little bit of help from some city-states in Italy, actually are able to defeat Russia. Now, this is a real blow to the Russian ego because they think they're a big country. They've got 1 out of every 20 men is in their military. 5% of their male population's in the military. So they've got a big military. They think they're tough. And they come to Crimea and they get beat. Now, you might say, wait a minute, Mr. McKernan, why would France and England want to fight Russia in the Black Sea to protect the Ottomans? I thought England and France didn't like the Ottomans. You're right. So why do they help? Well, what they don't want to have happen is they don't want Russia to become too powerful. They're afraid if Russia goes down there and takes Constantinople and takes over the Ottoman Empire, they will become the dominant power in the Mediterranean, and it will upset the balance of power in the world, and England and France won't be on top anymore. And so they're afraid of that. So they want to prevent Russia from expanding into the Ottoman Empire. Pretty good idea. And they are able to hold Russia off. Now, ironically, keep this in mind, England in 1854 through 1856 through the Crimean War helps keep the Ottoman Empire alive. And guess who England's going to have to fight in World War I? That's right. They're going to have to fight the Ottomans because the Ottomans are going to side with the Germans, and we've got a whole nother mess on our hands. But this is an embarrassment for Russia. So what does Russia decide? Russia decides under Tsar Alexander, and we're going to do a reading from him, or about him, not from him, sorry, about him. And he decides that Russia needs to reform because this should not be happening. Russia learned that why did they lose? Was it because of superior military techniques of the British? No. It was that the West had an industrial advantage through better weapons, more of them, bigger weapons. Okay? So Alexander II, as I just mentioned, believed reform was essential to survive militarily, and serfdom was a problem for industrialization. Now, you might say, why is serfdom a problem? Let's think back. Serfdom means that a serf is tied to the land. He's a peasant who has to work the land, right? Okay? So the serf has to work the land, and he can't leave the land. So he can't work in a factory, right? Unless the factory's actually on the manor, on the estate. But that's not the way industrialization works. Industrialization goes to where the power is, goes to the cities. So what the Russians need is they need these serfs, these peasants, to move to the cities to work in the industries. But they can't because they're serfs and they are legally bound to the land. And that's a right they have. And a curse because they have to work for the Lord. So Alexander's going to ban serfdom. He's going to outlaw it in 1861, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we do the reading. So how did industrialization look in Russia? Well, one of the problems Russia runs into right away is it requires state support. Why does it require national support. It requires national support because they do not have the capital, that is the money, to build the factories they need. Individuals, citizens don't have that extra money. In England, they do. In France, they do. In Germany, they will during this time period. Okay? Some of that's built on the trade in the sugar, trade in slaves, but they do have extra wealth. In Russia, they don't. So the government's got to put up the money to start these factories. They also will build something we call the Trans-Siberian Railroad. It's going to push iron and coal sectors from Eastern Russia and out in that part of the world, and they're going to build a transcontinental railroad from Siberia, and it'll bring it back to the east, bring coal and iron, and it's going to be a pretty successful industrialization for Russia. Between 1892 and 1903, the finance minister reforms Russia. He puts high tariffs to protect Russian businesses. And the Russian people didn't have enough money to open some of those industries. The Russian government didn't have enough money. So to whom do they turn? Western Europe. So in fact, about in 1900, estimates are that about half of the industries in Russia were actually owned by French or British or Germans. So they've come to be dependent upon them. That makes them a debtor nation. They owe France, Britain, and Germany money. And loans are going to pile up. And that's going to come back to haunt them during World War I. How else did industrialization look in Russia? Well, by 1900, industrial leaders, they are an industrial leader in a few areas, about 5 of them, but predominantly in steel, oil, and coal. But they're a leader not because they're efficient or because they're well run or particularly profitable. They're leaders because they got a lot of people and they've got a lot of natural resources. Russia has a lot of natural resources. Agricultural system is still inefficient. Yes, they've gotten rid of serfdom, but we're going to talk when we do the reading. One of the problems they run into is they give these serfs, these peasants, land of their own so that they can work the land and be successful for themselves. Yay. Problem? Well, the problem is these pieces of land they give them are really small, and they owe the government and the former landowners, those former aristocrats, money. They have to pay off what they got for the land. So if you got a little bit of land and you owe somebody else a lot of money, if you have 1 or 2 years of bad crops, you're broke. And a lot of these guys go bankrupt. In what ways are they different from the West? The West during this time period is changing its government to be a meritocracy. A meritocracy means, and I think I've said this before, merit, your skill, your intelligence, your work ethic give you power. So merit combined with the Greek word for power, ocracy. So meritocracy is you can advance on merit. In Russia, you become an officer because of who your family is. You are an officer because you've come from this long line of rich people. That does not necessarily make you a good soldier. Okay? However, there is no growing middle class in Russia. Because remember, I said half those businesses are owned by whom? English, French, or German. So who's got the middle class? Well, they've got the middle class. So there's no middle class. So we still have this aristocracy and lots of peasants down here, lots of poor. So they run into problems. So who were the factions who wanted change in Russia? Well, first off, everybody's mad at the Russian government. Everybody in the 1800s and the 19th century is mad at the Russian Tsar. You name them. Peasants. Yep, they're mad. Why? They suffer frequent famines. They suffer starvation. They live in horrible conditions. Remember, they had gotten land and they were going to be able to be independent and make it on their own. But the parcels of land were too small. The money they owed for the land was too much. And they went broke again and everything got reabsorbed back by some aristocrats. Business and professionals in Russia are unhappy. They want freedom in schools. They want to pass liberal, and by that I mean the right to vote and the right to own private property. That's what liberal means in the 1800s. It means the right to vote and the right to own private property. They want freedom in the schools. They want liberal reforms. However, they're not so aggressive as some other groups. We've got some more aggressive groups coming up. The intelligentsia. Look at that word. It sounds like a big word, but it's not. Intelligentsia is exactly what it looks like. Intelligent. Intelligentsia are people who are well educated. Okay, these guys are the most radical and the most articulate. In fact, our first modern terrorist movements are often associated with Russia during the late 1800s. I'll talk about that here in a second. Because there are terrorist movements, particularly with the anarchists, remember they're the people who want to reduce the level of formal government. They think they want to do away with a lot of formal government. They're terrorists. Well, Alexander II, who had freed the serfs and tried to make reforms in Russia, actually dies. And you're going to read this because a bomb gets thrown in his car and blows up, and he just bleeds out. And so every czar after him, at least for a little while, is going to come down hard. They're going to be ruthless. They're going to be brutal. They're going to be vicious. And so they repress not only the intelligentsia, the educated, they're also going to target Jews. Pogroms are going to be issued on Jews. So they're going to flee and they're going to go to Europe. Some of them are going to head off towards Palestine, which we're going to talk about in the next time period. Intellectuals and businessmen want to continue industrialization, but they don't want to become materialistic like the West. Anarchists, as I mentioned, want to abolish most forms of formal government. Vladimir Lenin comes along. Now, Lenin considered himself a Marxist. However, he's not exactly a Marxist like Karl Marx thought of. What do I mean by that? Well, Karl Marx said that you're going to have a proletariat, that is the workers, revolution, and it's going to happen because of working class people are going to revolt. If you remember, I mentioned that a couple chapters ago. Working class people are going to get so fed up with their situation that they're going to revolt against the owners of the factories. And that will allow us to set up a more shared ownership and experience and communal, that's the word communism, ownership. Lenin said, no, we don't need all those workers because Russia doesn't have them, right? Russia's a small industrialized country, at least a little bit industrialized, not a whole lot. So Lenin comes along and says, oh no, we can have a proletariat revolution led by intellectuals like Lenin and Trotsky. And he actually leads a group called the Bolsheviks, which in Russian means the majority party. However, in reality, they're not the majority party. They are the minority party. But be that as it may, they keep calling themselves the Bolsheviks, and eventually it sticks. Who else wanted change in Russia? The working class, the workers. There aren't a lot of industrial workers, but those who are there are in places like St. Petersburg and Moscow, and they're unhappy with their situation, much like workers in Western Europe had been unhappy with their working conditions. So they form labor unions. They engage in strikes. They suffer the negative conditions of industrialization. So revolution is inevitable in Russia. However, this is not to say it's coming anytime soon or smoothly. Russia is very fragmented. I mean, think of these groups. You've got intellectuals, you've got peasants, you've got the military, you've got conservatives, you've got anarchists, you've got communists like Lenin. And all these groups have to combine to fight the czar. And the only thing, they will eventually act somewhat together, but the only thing they share is they hate the czar. That's it. And that's going to create a whole nother problem in our next time period. Okay? So before we look at the reforms, I'm going to stop. That's about 20 minutes. So that's kind of a nice stopping spot. When we come back, we're going to pick back up with the revolution of 1905 and the kind of reforms Russia tries to instigate in order to survive. And then we'll look at Japan.